This is Generous Theology, and for this episode, Chuck and Brock are taking a look at Chapter 20, The Nature of Change, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
Now, I like that map, and as you lay that out, obviously we've been dealing in this chapter with the nature of change, and then in the next chapter we start talking about soul and body. And it is really interesting how on these two very different topics, that map seems, when we get into chapter 21, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But that idea of Plato versus Aristotle, and Plato being more engaged with the primacy of the non-corporeal and Aristotle the other way, also seems to play into some of these thoughts of body and soul that are obviously to Christians extremely interesting and very important as well.
So there's a beautiful section in the chapter, what kind of entity is change? And I love this layout. And I'm going to throw it out to you, Chuck. How did you understand this section? The professor talks about largely the nature of change with respect to the Aristotelian grid. So Aristotle's metaphysics, the of property, substance, quantity, place, and change fits within that interpretive grid. There are other grids, of course, like we mentioned, but the authors here take that approach, and it shows in the directions that the discussion goes. So why don't I just throw you into the hot part of the fire here and see what you thought about this section.
Yeah, so one of the things that, I don't know whether it gets at to what I thought about the section or whether it's just trying to get a little bit of a better handle on things. I think you're right that here Tyson really is focused on Aristotelian thinking. And when we've got this roadmap that shows that Plato has maybe a somewhat different way to think about these things, one of the things that I struggled a little bit with was just trying to figure out, did Tyson just forget about that way of thinking, or was it that with specific to the idea of change, was it that it was really with some of these later thinkers and the growth of Aristotelian thinking that we really got a lot more discussion about what change, because he does early on, he gets into some of these concepts of whether change is in and of itself its own thing. And later he moves away from that somewhat. And as you've noted, he gets into some of the more issues related to what the Aristotelian categories, that kind of thing. And as I was reflecting on especially the latter part of this chapter, that was one of the thoughts that I had. Is it that we're dealing with an author who is more focused on that, or are we dealing with a particular topic that perhaps was more interesting to the Aristotelian thinkers? And the reason I wonder about that is because there are, I think naturally, when we have a worldview, and here we're talking a little bit, maybe it's not specifically a worldview, a Platonic worldview versus an Aristotelian worldview. It's more complicated than that. But those two different ways of thinking about things really do impact not only how we think about things, but what things we find to be important. And I wondered, and I wonder if you have a sense of this, whether Tyson is perhaps thinking about these things because the Aristotelian focus on more sort of the empirical ways of looking at change, measuring change, just more naturally that sort of worldview is going to look at some of those issues rather than that Platonic worldview. Or do you think that maybe he just missed, and again, not to look too far ahead, but that in that next chapter, I think I found that the author, I felt, did a much more balanced job of dealing with both sides of things, but I didn't know whether that was a function, again, of a different topic. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, thank you for that. First of all, the professor spending the balance of time more with the Aristotelian side of things is not necessarily a sin. In some senses, Platonism largely dominated antiquity and the early Middle Ages, and then with the rediscovery and reemergence of Aristotle in the High Middle Ages or the Middle Ages, the locus really shifts. and we go from that Platonic, the dominance of the non-corporeal, and we start to look to the corporeal, to the material, to the things that have a physical shape and form dominating. That's not all bad. Science, for example, that's the realm of science. And it was wonderful to limit one's inquiry to simply material things. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. And there's some reasons perhaps why this happens. It's very difficult, as we'll talk about in the next chapter, Soul and Mind. Secular views, atheistic views, find it very difficult to thrive in settings where Platonic or Christian concepts dominate, because the non-corporeal governs the corporeal. And for example, here we talked about the Christian concept of creation. And so we have this non-corporeal, this immaterial personal being called God, who then creates the material reality. And so the material reality is subordinate to and depends upon that immaterial, non-created being. And so atheism and secularism find it very difficult to swim in those waters. That could be one reason for the push. There's also, like we say, the noble push towards science, and abstraction is the other big thing. Abstracting things out. Chuck, a car is something that I can drive, so it has this mechanical engineering aspect to it in understanding what it is. So if I am a mechanical engineer, I can study the workings of an automobile, understand its subsystems, and come up with a great analysis of why it is that the vehicle moves through time and space. Whereas some other person can study automobiles with respect to their financing. A car is something you can drive, but a car is something also you can purchase. And what's the social aspects of purchasing vehicles? What models drive the purchase and payments associated with creating and maintaining fleets of cars and creating and maintaining the infrastructure that we can then drive our vehicles in? And so the point is you can abstract and you can separate those two. So the mechanical engineer doesn't necessarily have to be very involved on the financial end, except to maybe just nominally acknowledge its existence. Same thing too with the accountant can study the finances of automobiles, but of course must acknowledge the material, mechanical aspects to it. And so I think that's where we are here. And so with this shift to Aristotle, the second main problem, the professor says in this chapter, associated with the nature of change, concerns its ontological status. Is change a separate entity, or is nothing besides the thing being changed? That's the issue. And those who wish to put the material aspects of reality over and against in the more dominant position than the immaterial, I think would tend to fall largely into the Aristotelian path, whereas those who put the governing ideas and forms into a more principled position would tend to follow the Platonic path. We get into this here. We talked already about Averroes, and I think we want to get to the later theory here, this idea of the formulas from Albert the Great, the forma fluens and the fluxus forms. So the formula fluens is the idea that change is a successive impression of the form upon the changeable body. So here, think of frames in an analog movie. Of course, we have digital now, which I guess we still do have frames, but especially in the older pre-digital film era, it was very well understood what looked to us on the movie screen as motion was actually just a rapid succession of immutable, static, unchangeable frames. And so motion in that sense represented this slicing of immutable things. And so you have this acquisition, this qualitative change happening, but it's happening as the frames of the movie are turning. And there's a resort located near where I live. And in the resort, they've recorded a high-speed photography, and they've put this very high-resolution detailed imagery that they've taken with this very high-resolution camera. And you can use a forward and backward knob to move and advance the movie very quickly, so you can spin it quickly, or you can move it forward very slowly, one frame at a time, and it's extremely high resolution. It almost looks continuous, but underneath it is nothing more than these successive immutable frames. And that's one way, maybe, to think about the forma fluens, is account for change. Is that real? That's one way of looking at reality. A, is it the only way? B, is it a legitimate way? C, is it perhaps the quote-unquote right way? And I'm just going to bounce off you how does that summary of the forma fluens hit you?
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. That the forma fluens really was just simply that successive change. And in fact, I have seen in some level of modern science a discussion of it, what is the smallest period of time that you can break anything into? And as if there is a smallest chunk of time, then what then must not motion be, not rather this fluid type of thing, but rather maybe extremely small differences, but still a session of where the object is and what its form is at this moment versus whatever the smallest amount of time is later versus smallest time ever. And while I don't have any sort of good understanding of quantum physics, it is at least my impression that some of the ideas around quantum physics get at some of that. Is there a way to, given that change isn't this fluid thing, but that there's just a here you are, and then a here you are, and then a here you are, is there a way using this sort of quantum physics to turn that on and off in a different way? And I can't pretend to have any sort of understanding of it other than to say that some of the weird things that happen with quantum physics seem to be being explained by that system rather than the fluxus formae, the directional type of thinking. And I'm not sure if I have that exactly correct, but would that seem to fit a little bit as well with some of the things we've seen and as you understand?